Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. This is Josh Wander from Yerushalayim HaKodesh. I'm here with my co-host, Rabbi Moshe Lichtman from Beit Shemesh. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome to you, too. Welcome to all of our listeners. And we hope you enjoyed today's show. We have a great show lined up for you. And Josh will tell you exactly what we have.
So this show is going to be dedicated to a idea of settling the land, not just moving to Israel, but how to make it a constructive and an opportune place for Jews to live, how to work the land, how to build the land, how to grow the land, all the different commandments that are involved in doing that, and how you can do that practically today. Any Jew in the world is able to do that today. There's great opportunities, and we're going to talk to somebody. We have a special guest, Joel Busner, is going to come on, and he's going to discuss it with us. I want to mention that Rabbi Lichtman has an amazing website that is at tagsoundcloud2010tracks1098828901, tagsoundcloud2010tracks1098828901. And over there, he has a list of all of his books. He sells his books over there and different opportunities that you can have for sponsorship of those books. So I would advise you to go over there and check it out. Also, check out my website, which is at itstimetoleave.com. Itstimetoleave.com is where you will find hundreds of videos in our series that deal with the commandment, the mitzvah, to live in Eretz Israel today. And we have a blog, and we have the different podcasts and all sorts of interesting materials for you to listen to and go through. This is a live show. If you happen to be unfortunately stuck outside of Eretz Israel and you're in North America, you can contact us at 301-768-4841. Again, 301-768-4841. And if you're fortunate enough to be in the land of Israel, you could also contact us with your questions and your comments at 02-650-0151. 02-650-0150. Of course, Israel Unplugged is where you get the unadulterated facts of where we're holding in the redemptive process, focusing primarily on the ingathering of the exiles. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. We have a special guest as promised. His name is Joel Yosef Busner. He is the founder and the director of buyapieceofisrael.com, and he is a former resident of Canada and the United States. Mr. Busner has invested his work time as a businessman and Jewish activist. He made Aliyah 23 years ago and founded the Buy a Piece of Israel project in 2005 to encourage Jewish investment in private Israeli agricultural lands in order to strengthen Jewish sovereignty in the Galilee, which is northern Israel. Welcome to the show, Joel.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So let's start from the beginning. What exactly is going on here? What is the point of what is your mission? What are you doing? And then we'll get into the logistics of how one gets involved.
Well, there are several issues, but they're all tied together. First of all, we see a lot of lands in the Galilee being private lands that is being bought out by Arabs from formerly Jewish owners, and we also see a lot of state land commandeered by Arabs, where they just settle illegally, build illegally, plant illegally, etc. And of course, with that, there's also been a lot of arson, theft, vandalism, extortion, etc., against Jewish farmers. Over time, what has happened is there's less and less Jewish farmers, and on top of that, many areas of the Galil are becoming less and less Jewish. As a country, Israel was established. Originally, we had Chalutzim, we had the pioneers that came and worked the land, etc., etc. In the last many years, through government policy, education system, etc., the idea of Jewish manual labor has become frowned upon. They call it avodah shchora, black work. But the truth is that it's very important in a Jewish country that not everybody is a computer programmer, not everybody is a lawyer, and some people work the fields, and some people clean offices, and some people plant gardens. So we decided when I was living up north, and I saw what was going on, and we were using for volunteerism. We were using different classes of high schools during the olive harvest to pick olives for Jewish farmers as volunteers, but it wasn't growing. So that's when we decided to make it into a business rather, as you could say, charitable work, and to also get Jews also from Israel and mainly from outside of Israel, from diaspora, to feel much more connected to the land of Israel by actually owning some of it, and not just owning some of it, by having something done with it, and that's what we're doing. So we're planting these lands with some of the owners, for some of the owners. We're working it, and we hope to expand it more and more, and hopefully it'll become something that will help tip the scales, where the Jews are the ones buying back the land again, like it once was 100 years ago.
There are many commandments that are only applicable here in the land of Israel, and
Correct.
Many of those commandments revolve around agriculture and the land itself. So how does one who is, let's say, living abroad, how is he able to fulfill these commandments that are specifically agricultural in the land of Israel?
Well, the most obvious one this year is beginning of Rosh Hashanah is the Shemitah, the every seventh year. And if you're owning private land in Israel and you're leaving it fallow for the year, you are in fact keeping Shemitah. So that's very important.
As easy as that. The sabbatical,
and very few people do that.
Just means don't touch the land.
Right. The land is not worked. We don't do heter mechira. What we do, if necessary, if let's say the earth becomes parched or something, we might get a permission to put minimal water to keep something alive. All the grown trees don't get anything. I'm talking about the ones that were planted recently. But we're not doing anything that's not allowed in the strictest terms. That's for one example. There's also Orla. Not until 3 years are passed into the fourth year can you pick fruits from fruit trees in Israel, for harvest, which is allowable everywhere else except Eretz Israel. So your land also it's being observed. At the same time,
Orla is involved. We do it outside of the land of Israel, but it's only it's rabbinical outside of Israel, and here it's from the Torah.
Here it's from the Torah, including Truba V'Maiser, including Teyak, many of those things. And on top of all that, you're employing all Jewish labor. We only use Jewish labor, only use Avodah Ivrit from the beginning till now. I can't tell you it's easy, but we do it. And also, as of, I think it's 6 years ago now, we no longer use any sprays, any chemical sprays. They call here risus, pesticides, herbicides, nothing. So there's a lot more work in cutting and trimming, especially in the spring after the heavy rains of the winter. You have a lot of thorns and heavy weeds growing, and we have to keep knocking it down and cutting it out and plowing it much more than let's say 94% or 95% of the other farming businesses.
Well, what
hi,
is private?
Joel.
Go ahead.
So,
Go ahead.
Joel, I'm the co-host of the show, Moshe Lichtman. Shalom Aleichem.
Yes.
It's nice to meet you.
Shalom.
So I wanted to ask you, so what kind of people, you're talking about Avodah Ivrit, so who are these people who are actually working the land? What kind of people do you find that want to do this, what you call Avodah Shchora, this black work?
Okay. Currently, we have a farmer named Giddy, who's a lifetime farmer from Yavniel, and his family's been it till now, and he's in charge of most of the overall farming. We have another fellow named Rabbi Chayon, who's also from the Lower Galil, and he's does what they call gardening, but it's mostly like the trimming, the pruning. He's also part of the planting, etc. These guys do it full time, not just for us, but they do it full time. And then we have myself. I have my right hand man, David Stefanski, who also does sales, but he also he does the plantings. He does the harvest, organizes it. We have my son.
How big is this land? How big is this land? I mean, you're talking about 5-6 people who are working it. It must be a small.
Yeah, but it also depends when, because, for example, the harvest this season, we could have, in a particular day, we can have 30 or 40 people in the field that day because it's seasonal. So we'll use schools. We'll hire, for every 4 or 5 volunteers, we'll hire a strong adult male for that period, for that couple of weeks, for example.
What are you growing, Joel?
We're growing olives, mainly but not exclusively Suri olives. We like the oil.
Okay. And what is private land? Can you tell us a little bit about the idea of private land in Eretz Yisrael?
Can you say that again? I didn't hear.
Can you define what private land? I know that you work specifically with
private land. It's very it's to people from abroad. They're not used to this. Israel was founded by a socialist government. There were people before the founding of the state who purchased land and registered it. After the government came into being in 1948, they tried to nationalize as much as possible. So if you didn't know where your land was, or if it hadn't, or it wasn't purchased, so it was nationalized. So today, 93% of the land in the state of Israel is not private land. 80% is different forms of government ownership, and 13% is Keren Kayemet, JNF. 7% is private. That's what we deal in.
So what does that mean? When somebody buys an apartment here in Israel, they don't actually own the land?
No. But what's going on with apartments is they have something called registering it in Tabu, which means that if there's a technicality where the lawyer can have it permanently placed in that person's hands, the apartment itself.
And then there's something like a long-term lease or something from the government?
Mostly, yeah. Like, for example, you buy a meshek, it's called, a big plot of land in the Moshav, okay? That's a long-term lease. All those kind of things. If you buy in a yeshuv, a settlement, even, and when I say settlement, so people think of Judea and Samaria, but you also have all over the Galilee. You have settlement communities where those lands are generally government-owned, and you're getting a long-term situation.
Incredible. So you're planting the olive trees, then you're harvesting them, you're squeezing, you're pressing them, and making olive oil, and then you sell that olive oil?
And then we sell the olive oil as boutique olive oil in 1 liter and 3/4 liter bottles. We currently only domestically. What we have now expanded, this is mostly for Rosh Pina. Those are the older trees, but the newer ones, and where we're expanding now in Yavniel, fast forward 2 years, 3 years after Orla of what's been planted and what we're taking care of, then we'll have a lot more oil to process, and we will be applying for export licensing to hopefully get more per liter.
Amazing. So we're going to go on a break. And
Okay.
afterwards, I wanted to discuss with you, if you could stick around, a little bit about the mitzvah, going into the exact mitzvah that are performed and how one goes about doing it with you. So stick around, and we'll be right back.
Okay, thank you.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged, and we're in the middle of a very interesting conversation about the mitzvot of living in Israel and buying land in Israel. I just wanted to start this segment with a comment on something that was said by our guest, Joel. Joel, your last name again? I'm sorry, Bosner?
B-U-S-N-E-R.
Okay. That you said that in the beginning of the state, people were more idealistic and were willing to get their hands dirty. And now people think that it's better to be a computer programmer, a doctor, a lawyer, etc. It's so funny because from a halachic perspective, there's no question that the main fulfillment, the real main fulfillment of the mitzvah of dwelling in the land of Israel is to actually work the land, physically work the land and bring forth its holy fruits. There's a very famous Chatam Sofer that says that the pasuk of Ve'asafta diganecha, you shall gather your grains. So Rabbi Yishmael says that that's not just an allowment of you're allowed to do that. You don't have to sit and learn all day. You're also allowed to gather your grains. He says no, it's an ideal. We should be gathering our grains. And the Chatam Sofer says that's only in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, where it's a mitzvah to bring forth the holy fruits of Eretz Yisrael. And then he says, and it could be possibly that other forms of social welfare, of things that other professions that are needed in the land of Israel are also included in the mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz. But the main fulfillment is actually working the land. I wish I was younger. I would come to the Galil and I would get my hands dirty and I would join you and I would become a farmer. That's what I would love to do. I just probably wouldn't be able to do it at my age right now. But
well, I'll tell you something. Last week, we did the last planting before Shemitah, and we had a couple of 80-year-olds out there.
Wow.
It's not full-time for them, obviously. They're retirees, but they want to be part of it. And that's what I'm talking about, the whole spirit of doing what you can. You could be a doctor, but take 2 days a year to go work a field. You could be a retiree. You could be a high school student, but everybody should feel it and know what it is. Experience it.
100%. Yeah. Great.
So it's amazing. There's a commentary that known as the Even Ezra, and the Even Ezra writes that buying property, buying land in Israel is equivalent to buying a portion in the world to come. So this is big stuff. When people have the ability today to purchase land in the land of Israel, this is not little stuff. It's not only, I'm hesitant to use the word only, but it's not only fulfilling all the commandments like we mentioned, Orla and Shemitah and Truma and Meiser and Leket and Shicha and Peah and all the different things that have to do, and of course redeeming the land itself. It's also actually purchasing land in the world to come. Now, I was mentioning before the show that there's actually a Talmudic story. I'm not going to go into the whole, we don't have time to go into the whole story right now, but in the beginning of the tractate of Psachim, that speaks about a rabbi that lived in the northern part of Israel in a place called Netzivim, and it explains that he had influence even in Jerusalem, even in the south, because of an incident that happened during the Paschal sacrifice on Pesach. And the question is asked by many rabbis over there, why is it that he was in the north having this influence in Jerusalem? Why wasn't he coming on the pilgrimage to bring the Paschal sacrifice on Pesach? Why was he in the north? And there are many different answers that are given, but the first answer that is given by Tosfot is Lo haya lo karka. He did not have land. And the position that the Tosfot is taking there is that a person does not have land, they are not able to bring karbanot, they're not able to come to the Temple Mount and bring a sacrifice, because you have to own land in the land of Israel. And today, more than ever before, it is practical and easy to buy land. And this is something I know that Joel is involved with every day. And we actually have a very special offer for our listeners that are interested in this. They should go to the website, his website, buyapieceofisrael.com/special, and they will see those special pricing that is just for our listeners. And over there, you have the ability to buy small portions of land. You don't have to buy many dunam. You can buy many acres. You could just buy 1/36 of a dunam, which has one tree, or which is at a very, I would think it's a very small price to pay for a piece in the world to come. Or you could buy 6 trees, 10 trees. By the way, the Talmud does mention that when it speaks about kerem, when it speaks of, how do you define kerem?
A vineyard.
A vineyard. It says that that's talking about 5 trees. So it could be that you'd be interested in that. If you can't afford that, maybe 1 tree. Any way you want to go, this is a great opportunity, and I commend Joel for doing this incredible work for the people of Israel. Please tell us a little bit more about what is involved in the process of purchasing land in Israel.
Well, on all purchase, I mean, there's many facets. All purchases, there's purchase taxes called mas rechisha. Some lands, not all lands, have VAT, value-added tax, called MAM in Israel. Some do not. Companies that buy have to pay the VAT, but they get it back. Charities who buy have to pay VAT. They do not get it back. And who's selling the land. So if the person selling the land is not considered a business, so there usually will not be VAT if an individual buys from that person. In most cases, when we're talking only about agricultural land, parcels, it's by block and parcel numbers, and they're all mapped out on the official government maps. Everything's numbered. They can range from as low as 2 or 3 dunam. A dunam is approximately a quarter acre. You have some as big as 50, 60, 70 dunam. So what we do is we try to give everybody a chance to get involved. So we either make a contract with a seller, or we have someone else buy it because we've got a good price. And then we offer from the smallest sizes. Now we made it even smaller to 1/42nd of a dunam, which is 20-something square meters, about 200, I think 250 square feet, something like that. And then we keep working our way up until we get to the 250 meters, 500 meters, which is a half dunam, the dunam, which is 1,000 meters, and then multiple dunam. So it gives everybody a chance. Obviously, over certain amounts of purchase will be slightly lower prices because certain expenses of ours go down per meter. For example, the lawyer is registering a tiny one, he's registering a big one. It's the same time for the lawyer. So that has to be taken into consideration. Just one example. If you have any more specific questions.
I want to clarify something, Joel. I think that a lot of people are used to the idea of buying trees in Israel, of going to the JNF or whatever organization and buying planting a tree in Israel. This is not what you do. Also, there are many organizations now that are popping up before the Shemitah year that are involved in a temporary purchase of property, of land, for 1 year, for the year of Shemitah, and just for that year, and then it's sold off afterwards. So what differentiates what you're doing from these other organizations?
We didn't go into this for Shemitah. And we didn't go into this to sell trees. We went to connect Jews, to make Jews buy land in Israel, hopefully to get more to come home, many more. We did it so that we would increase sovereignty, not just in the Galilee, but everywhere, but to start with the Galilee. So therefore, yes, we're keeping Shemitah because that's what we have to do. But we can't compete with a $1,400 or $1,500 purchase of land permanently. We can't compete with somebody selling something for a couple $100 for this year only, and you don't have a piece of land next year. And we don't try to. We're looking at a much bigger game. We're looking much longer, much more permanent. And I think that's the essential difference. That's as far as, let's say, Shemitah organizations, some of who are doing a very good job, so people will keep Shemitah who otherwise wouldn't. As far as planting trees in Israel, I think it's a nice endeavor, but we thought about it a lot, and we felt that Jewish people will stand up more for what they own than what they just threw a donation at. For example, I'll just give you an example. This is more called political, I call it ideological. Imagine the land around the exterior around Gaza were privately owned by lots of Jews around the world, and they started getting balloon arson fires and all this other Hamas and jihad nonsense. They would be pressuring the Israeli government much more than anybody from outside of Israel does today, because it's a bad it's a bad scenario. But you turn the page tomorrow morning, it's another day. But if it's your land with your trees, not trees are donated, it's your trees, it's your land. Now it means something, and it's just the human nature. And Jews will feel much more attached, and they'll fight much stronger and stand up for it if they own it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate all the knowledge that you've given us. For those that are interested in purchasing land in Israel in the Shemitah year or any other year, Joel's website is buyapieceofisrael.com. And when you add /special to it, when you add the word special to the end, you will get special pricing only for listeners of this show, Israel Unplugged. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Ben-Tekoa, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
So welcome back to Israel Unplugged. We had this great conversation. If you missed it, definitely tune into the podcast afterwards. We had a great conversation with Joel Busner about his website, buyapieceofisrael.com. And again, there's a special sale for our listeners if you put /special afterwards. And you can actually own a piece of the land of Israel that belongs to you, and you will be fulfilling all of the commandments that one can fulfill here on the land of Israel, wherever you are in the world. And again, like I mentioned, it is like buying, according to some opinions, a piece in the world to come. we wanted to
I
talk.
just want to interrupt for a second. I think we have to just make one thing very clear, that we are not encouraging Jews to feel complacent in the diaspora and think that they could continue living in the diaspora, and as long as they bought a piece of a 5x5 piece of land in the land of Israel, so that's it. They're fulfilling all the mitzvot, and they don't have to come to live here. Obviously, Josh, I know that you agree with me on this, that the real fulfillment of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of living in the land of Israel, is to actually live in the land of Israel. And whether it's to till the land, to work the land, or maybe to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever is needed in the country, that's already a discussion. But it's what we would call b'di'evad. Not the ideal way to do it is to stay and remain in the diaspora and buy a piece of land. If you have to stay there, then you should definitely, for now, temporarily, of course, you definitely should buy a piece of land so that temporarily at least you can have some connection to the land of Israel and fulfill some of the mitzvot that you can fulfill even from afar. But of course, the ideal situation is to come and live here.
So let me clarify or rephrase what I was saying. You should buy a piece of land in Israel, even if you're living in Israel. We hope that everybody's going to move to Israel and they'll be living here. But even if you live here, you should own a piece of the plot in the land of Israel, and not just if you happen to be abroad. And definitely that is not an excuse for not living here, as Rabbi Lichtman correctly pointed out. In fact, the Talmud speaks very harshly about people that come here only to die, people that come here only to be buried here, and they don't come to live here. So which is unfortunately what many Jews around the world, they live abroad their entire lives, and then they get shipped over here to be buried, and that the Talmud speaks about in the most harsh terms. So we have to make sure that people come here to live, not just to die. And today, there's no better day to do that as today. Whether you're here in Israel, whether you're not in Israel, this is an opportunity to own land. And like Joel was saying, our guest was saying before the break, once you own land in Israel, if you're not living here, it gives you a certain skin in the game that you're going to care a lot more about that land because you own it, it's yours, and you're going to treat it differently, hopefully better. And it's, if nothing else, hopefully it'll pull you to come here and to move here on a permanent basis.
Correct. So we were discussing during the break also that there's actually two concepts when it comes to this mitzvah, this great mitzvah. By the way, another thing is, the agricultural mitzvot are extremely important. No one is going to deny that. But the actual mitzvah of living in the land of Israel, of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, is a mitzvah that, according to the rabbis, actually in this week's parsha is where they learn it from, that it's a mitzvah that is equal to all the other mitzvot in the Torah. So it's what we would call a mega mitzvah. It's one of the 7 mitzvot that are equal to all the other mitzvot in the Torah. So there is this concept of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. But we also find another concept called Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael. And without going into all the sources, there are some places where it uses Yishuv and sometimes where it uses Yeshivat. So I was mentioning to Josh, and I'm still waiting I can't wait to hear what he thinks the difference between the two of them are. But I was telling him that in the book that I'm about to come out with, which I think we discussed a little bit last week, called The Dawn of Redemption, or Ayelet HaShachar, the author there differentiates between Yishuv and Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael as follows. That one mitzvah is that every Jew should live in the land of Israel. And that's why, for example, the Talmud says that a man can force his wife and a woman can force her husband to make aliyah. If there's an argument between the couple, the one who wants to move to Israel is the one that wins the argument halachically. And the other one has to go along with them and live in Israel. And that is referring to the mitzvah of Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael, to dwell in, for a Jew, for every individual Jew to come and live in the land of Israel. But there's another aspect, and that is the aspect of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, which I would call more settling the land of Israel. There's to settle in, and there's settling the land of Israel. That means that every Jew, even those who already live in the land of Israel, have an obligation to try to make the land of Israel as expansive as possible, as livable as possible, and that's the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, which would mean an amazing thing. Rav Filber says. He says that if all the Jewish people, literally every single Jewish person, lived in the land of Israel, but they only lived in, let's say, 80% of the land, but there was still 20% of the land that was desolate, or that was owned or ruled by a different entity, by some other nation. So we would still have a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, to conquer and to settle that other 20%, which is not settled and is not conquered, even though every Jew was already living in the land of Israel. So that's the way I understand, and the Rav Filber understands the difference between these two concepts. What do you? What did you hear, Josh?
No. Similarly, the difference is one is actually living here, and like you're saying, the other one is working the land. And working the land can be on a level of agriculture, when that's the ideal, is to be involved in agriculture. But even someone who is benefiting the society, is coming as a doctor, a lawyer, a computer programmer, whatever it is coming here and bettering the society. They are involved in the building of Eretz Yisrael, and that is also in itself a mitzvah. I also want to mention that there are 2 times that the Torah and the 5 books, it's mentioned the concept of someone going and buying something for full price, for currency, running out and buying something. And the only 2 times that you see this idea of running out and purchasing something for money is first time is, of course, Avraham Avinu, when he's purchasing a plot for his wife to be buried, for Sarah, in Ma'arat Machpelah in Hebron. So he goes out and he gives 400 shekels to purchase this plot. And the second time we see it is by Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our forefather, he comes back to Eretz Yisrael, and he immediately goes to Shem, and he purchases a plot. And it says that he came on Erev Shabbat, on the eve of the Sabbath, and he immediately, that was the first thing he had to run, and he had to buy a plot of land in the land of Israel. These are the 2 times that we see that shows us how important it is to own a plot of land here in Israel, that our forefathers, they saw it as like that was the first thing they had to do. They came into the land, they needed to have a plot, they needed that. And this again points back to what we were saying before, that it's not only physical. There's something about owning land in Israel being something spiritual, but buying a plot not only in the land of Israel as it is today, but buying a plot, buying a place in the world to come. And these are incredible, incredible things. I think if every Jew understood the importance of buying some land in the land of Israel and how easy it is to do today, then everybody would be running out today and buying land in Israel. And we wouldn't have a problem with all the things that our guest mentioned, that other nations are coming and they're trying to take over our land, both not only in the Galilee, he didn't mention, but not only in the north in the Galilee is this happening, but it's also happening in mass in the south, in the Negev, in the desert, where Bedouin are taking over large swaths of land, and this is a very, very serious thing that we need to stop. Again, I'm not getting into ideology. I'm trying to focus on the positive, on the wonderful idea of being able to fulfill all of these commandments here in the land of Israel, commandments that you could not do anywhere else in the world.
Yes, so I'm sure you know that there is a third place. It's not in the Chumash. I know you know this.
That's why I mentioned 5 books.
Right, 5 books. I know that. I noticed. But there is a third place where we find that one of our great leaders bought a piece of land, and that is David HaMelech. King David bought
the piece of land.
The place where you, when you get up in the morning every day in Har Zeitim, you look out onto, and that is Har HaBayit. King David bought Har HaBayit. And there's a very famous midrash which says that there are 3 places where the nations of the world are incapable. They cannot taunt us and say we stole it from them. And those are these three places which are mentioned clearly in our Bible that we purchased them. So what are they going to say? Of course, Temple Mount, right? Har HaBayit means Temple Mount. So the question is asked, well, that's a little bit strange because these are probably the three places that the non-Jews claim more than any other place. The Har HaBayit, Hebron, Temple Mount, Hebron, and Shechem. So what does this midrash mean? So we don't have a lot of time, but if you look at the first piece in my book, Eretz Yisrael and the Parsha, you'll get an answer. The answer is basically that it's not for us to convince them. The non-Jews are never going to be convinced that the land belongs to us. These three places where the Torah says that we own it is to convince ourselves. Self-convincing. We have to convince ourselves that the Jewish people that we own the land and that no one else owns it, and we have to take possession of the land and feel comfortable about it. So that ends our show today. Join us again next week, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.